You're welcome. Everyone, please find a seat. We're going to start the program in just a few moments. Please find a seat. If everyone could please find a seat. We're going to start in just a moment. Good evening. Good evening. Thank you. Good evening. I'm John Miko, the Executive Director of the Union League Legacy Foundation. It's my great pleasure to welcome you to tonight's Library Hour. The Legacy Foundation, of course, as you all know, is the nonprofit charity of the League. And we use the values and the history, the collections of this great institution, the Union League, to make better informed, more engaged citizen leaders. And the program we've been doing since 1946, more than any other, I think, that speaks to that, is Good Citizen Day. Good Citizen Day is on March 29th. So we're just a couple of weeks away from that. I know we have some Good Citizen Day committee members. I see Ted over there. I'm not sure who else. I know we have others, members of, Lisa, and of course, Jeff is a member of our board, but it's a really incredible day of civics education. It's something we want to do much, much more of. So look for more news on that and look for how you can support those and other great educational programs that we do throughout the year. All of our programs are made possible through voluntary contributions from members and others who support our work and support the values of the Union League of Philadelphia. So we have a program tonight, of course, run about an hour, as they always do. We will have questions and answers. We will use the microphone. We had some problems last time, people. It's a couple sentences and a question mark. So I will be on the short. Where's our audio guys? They're going to cut you off. Okay. So we're looking for questions for our speaker tonight. Please take a moment to silence, or better off, please turn off your cell phones. And while you do that, I'll just mention two upcoming programs. We do take a little bit of a break because of Good Citizen Day, but we have two wonderful programs on the calendar. April 11th, we have a Liberty series with Amity Schlaze. It's titled Prosperity, Peace, and the Role of Government, but the biographical backdrop to that is Calvin Coolidge, and she's a wonderful historian and speaker. I think you'll enjoy that. And then on April 18th, Civil Roundtable, Political Philosophies of Abraham Lincoln and Frederick Douglass with Joseph Fornieri. So we hope we will see you at those programs. And now, without any further ado, I introduce to you who will introduce our speaker, the one, the only, the historian of the Union League, the historian of the Union League Legacy Foundation, Mr. Jim Mundy. Jim.
All right. Well, pleasure to see everybody here this evening, and thanks for coming out. So, David Scott Brown is the Horace E. Raffensperger Professor of History at Elizabethtown College. Pop quiz. Where's Elizabethtown? No, not New Jersey. Oh, southeast of Harrisburg. Okay. Just want to make sure we know our geography. That's all. All right. He is the author of several books, including biographies of Richard Hofstadter and F. Scott Fitzgerald. Dr. Brown is a native of Troy, Ohio. Next geography question. Where's Troy, Ohio? It's on the west side, about 20 miles north of Dayton. Okay. All right. Almost Indiana. He graduated from Wright State University and earned a master's degree from the University of Akron. He completed his PhD in 1995 at the University of Toledo. Dr. Brown joined Elizabethtown College in 1997 after previously teaching at the University of Toledo and Saginaw Valley State University. He was named Raffensperger Professor in 2012. Among other books, he is also the author of Thomas Jefferson, A Biographical Companion, Moderates, The Vital Center of American Politics from the Founding to Today, and Paradise Lost, A Life of F. Scott Fitzgerald. And ladies and gentlemen, it is my pleasure and privilege to introduce you to our speaker, Dr. David Scott Brown. Doctor. Have fun. You bet.
So thank you, Jim. And wow, the Union Club, this is a real treat for me. I've admired it a long time from afar. And this is actually the first time I've been inside. So yeah, populism. I'm catching up my mind a little bit. At 8 o'clock this morning, it was a lecture on the New Deal. At 12 o'clock, it was a lecture on the Beatles' Revolver album. You've got to find ways to kind of bring non-history majors to history classes. And now I'm at the Union Club and I'm talking about Jackson and populism. The academic calendar is nothing if not eclectic. Thursday will bring more treats. So why populism? Why now? I came to the project in 2017 and we just had a presidential election. There was a lot of talk about populism and it kind of connected me in a sense with my youth in politics because I remember another billionaire populist, Ross Perot, the early mid-1990s, who twice ran for the presidency. And there was always that question I didn't quite grasp at that time, which is, can a billionaire really be a populist? So it's 2017. I just finished up with the Fitzgerald biography. I was looking for a new project and populism seemed to be out there. I'd done some work in the Jacksonian period in graduate school. It had always interested me. And I felt, you know, I want to get to the root of this, at least in terms of presidential politics, populism. What do we mean by populism? And this drew me to Andrew Jackson and his era. So a real quick definition of how I'm using populism tonight and in the book, a critique of elites. This could be a critique of elite culture, elite politics, elite economics. And Andrew Jackson sort of, he hit those buttons. He was responsive to public outcry against elites in the 1820s and the 1830s. And this did not make him into a national hero. He was a national hero years before because of the Battle of New Orleans, but this really solidified his place in American history. Digging into the biography, the research for it, it became clear that Andrew Jackson did not aspire to have George Washington's popularity. He eclipsed it completely. He really had a mass audience, which is something difficult for us to perhaps reconcile with today because his reputation has been sinking for quite some time. So let me talk a little bit about Jackson and the historians. Because Jackson, I mentioned Washington, there's only so much that you could do with George Washington. His reputation doesn't really change much over time. Jackson's does a whole lot because for some reason, we can really read contemporary issues into Andrew Jackson in a way that for the most part with Washington or Rutherford B. Hayes, Chet Arthur, or even Thomas Jefferson, it can be very difficult to do. So think about this. It's the 1890s and there is a populist movement. There's the Populist Party. It's going to run presidential candidates. It's going to be actually one of the more successful third parties in the country's history. In the 1890s, it would control 12 state houses in the Union. You go to a place like Kansas and you'd say, it's the Kansas legislature. Who's the majority party? It's got to be the Democrats, the Republicans. No, it's the populists in a dozen states, right? So the historian is Frederick Jackson Turner. Turner is most famous for the frontier thesis. How do we explain America, character, independence, democracy? It is the frontier. It's the frontier. He also had a lot to say about Andrew Jackson. Turner was from Wisconsin. He was watching the populist movement, and he was asking the same question I would ask later. Where is this coming from? And he identifies Andrew Jackson, 18 teens, 1820s, a phrase not used much today, but common man democracy. So Frederick Jackson Turner says it's the frontier that gives birth to Jacksonianism. Look at all these new states that entered the Union between, say, 1800 and 1825. All of them will go for Andrew Jackson, and they will elect him to the presidency. So it wasn't just or nearly the nation. It was really the western parts of the country that did this. There was a little bit of a personal dynamic here. Frederick Jackson Turner, whose father was born in 1832, the year that Jackson won re-election to the presidency. And so, of course, his father was named, as many, many boys were for a while, Andrew Jackson Turner, in this case. I haven't done a study on this, but I was told years and years ago that the most ubiquitous county name in America is, in fact, Jackson County. So Frederick Jackson Turner says, populism, where did it come from? It came from the frontier masses who found a Messiah in Andrew Jackson. That was the ruling paradigm in American historical thinking for a couple of generations. But then times change, and our approach to Andrew Jackson changes a bit as well. By the 1920 census told us that for the first time in our country's history, more Americans were now living in cities than in the countryside. That probably didn't have a major impact on the way that most Americans actually live their lives. But in terms of mentally, how Americans begin to conceive of themselves, what are Americans? The answer had always been, we live in an agrarian republic. We're more or less a farming kind of people. And now that wasn't the case any longer. So could Andrew Jackson minister to this country? Also, of course, the 1930s, there was a Great Depression. What was the Depression about? For some, it was a financial community that had gone rogue and took the nation's economy down with it. So enter one Arthur Schlesinger Jr. Schlesinger Jr. may be most famous as a public intellectual who, after several years at Harvard University, went on a 2-year leave, which became permanent at Harvard. He took the leave to become a special assistant and work in John F. Kennedy's White House. He would go on to write a Pulitzer Prize-winning book of the Kennedy presidency, 1,000 Days. This was 1965. The first Pulitzer Prize-winning book was written in 1945, and that was The Age of Jackson. And so Schlesinger, he's thinking about Jackson, but he's also thinking about America in the 1920s, in the 1930s, the 1940s. He says, Turner was right about something. Jacksonianism, it was a populistic movement, but it wasn't really about the West. The West was retrograde, backward. This was really about the laboring working class in the Northeast. This is a story about Philadelphia, about New York City. So a little bit about Schlesinger Jr. This is the book he writes, The Age of Jackson. It's about the working class in the 30s. But you get a little bit of distance and you ask yourself, what 30s is he talking about here? Is he writing about the 1930s or the 1830s? The bank war for Schlesinger Jr. and lots of scholars, this had been the principal organizing theme of Jacksonianism. The idea that the country had this second national bank in the United States, it was dominant in finance, and it had too much power. It threatened to overawe the pure Republican principles of the country. It could do other things. It could pay lobbyists. It could bribe congressmen. So before there's the Gilded Age, there's a kind of idea of a Gilded Age light in the 1820s and 1830s. Schlesinger has this heroic figure, Andrew Jackson, who in the 30s, the 1830s, smites this rogue financial organization and brings peace and prosperity et cetera, back to the people. I'm simplifying this a little bit, but not in the major outlines. And so critics, they said, great book, reads like a novel. Here's your Pulitzer. But are you really reflecting on Andrew Jackson or on Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who was against those quote unquote malefactors of great wealth? Are you writing about the 19th century, or are you writing about the 20th century? So when I was in graduate school, I mentioned, I think, or maybe Jim did, that I was doing some work on the Jacksonian period. And I went there to Toledo because there was a scholar there who had written a book on Jackson and the historians. And historiography always interested me. And so I said to him, Professor Cave, great book. How'd the research go? Did you talk to all the scholars? He said, oh yeah, talked to all of them. I said, how'd it go with Arthur Schlesinger Jr.? He said, it was interesting. He said, I was interviewing him and I said to him, Professor Schlesinger, great book, but does your book, does it hew to objectivity or does it vote for the Democratic Party? He said, he smiled and said, what would be wrong with that? A public intellectual, great response. So Arthur Schlesinger Jr. has the Jackson, who is in fact still a man of the people. That hasn't changed, but the optics and the region and the class divisions, they've changed as well. So Arthur Schlesinger Jr., the thesis, it begins to, I wouldn't say fall apart, but it begins to get a little bit old. This is the name of the game in history: revision. And so you've got a civil rights movement. You've got, in effect, a cultural revolution, not just in China in the 1960s, but in a different respect in the United States as well. You've got a women's movement. A lot of things are changing. Arthur Schlesinger Jr., if you look in the index of the book, there's one scant citation to Indian removal. It just really wasn't part of the purview of that generation of scholars. Again, it's the bank war that takes center place. One could get an idea that Jackson had a plantation if one read Schlesinger's book, but the notion of Andrew Jackson playing a critical role in both in the presidency and before he became president, in carving out an empire in the American now Southwest, which would be open to enslavement, that really wasn't in that generation's purview either. And so by the 1960s, there is a real change in scholarship and in historiography. And Schlesinger's book, like a lot of books, feels the heat of that. I think the great synthesis which emerges, it takes a while. It's not until 2007. So the scholar is Daniel Walker Howe, and the book is What Hath God Wrought? The Transformation of America, 1815 to 1848. The dates are very specific because this is a book in the Oxford History of the United States series. Very, very prestigious series. I believe at least 3 of them have won Pulitzer Prizes, including Daniel Walker Howe's. So Walker, how he looks at Jackson, and he finds kind of a backward figure. What did Jackson and Jacksonianism really stand for? And the argument is agrarianism, slavery, states' rights, which in 1860, with the coming of the Civil War, it smashes. What is the future? In the future, particularly by the late 20th century and the early 21st century, I mentioned this book came out in 2007. I think the first iPhone came out in 2007 as well. For Daniel Walker Howe, technology is key here. And what helps to promote technology is a culture that believes in improvement. And he makes the argument that Jackson and what he stood for didn't really embody improvement, that the Jacksonian movement was really kind of a backward glance to the past. We don't want to change. We like things the way that we are. And And so the idea of promoting a national bank, the idea of advancing women's rights, the idea of having serious conversations about abolitionism, these were off the table as far as the Jacksonians were concerned. Daniel Walker Howe makes the argument that, in fact, it's not Jackson who is the leader, the political leader of this era, but rather it is John Quincy Adams. And he goes so far, and this is a great move on his part because it's iconic. It doesn't matter if it's literally true or not, but he says, in fact, this was never the age of Jackson. It was the age of who? It was the age of John Quincy Adams. That hasn't quite caught on. I don't really see that in textbooks. I don't see a lot of people talking about it. But to kind of double down on that, if you have a copy of the book, you might look and see who it's dedicated to. It's dedicated to the memory of John Quincy Adams, which is interesting. Often books are dedicated to spouses, to best friends, to colleagues, to students. This is dedicated to a president who hasn't been with us for a very, very long period of time, okay? So Daniel Walker Howe says that really this is about the future, and the Jacksonians did not embody or represent the future. A great book, and I love to teach with this book, but I think, as with the other syntheses, age has taken hold a little bit, and what looked like a really sure thesis in 2008, 2010, it's fallen apart in some places. For example, what is the future? The future clearly is centralization. Where are states' rights at? Well, states' rights, it's gone. It's pretty much over. And then interesting things happen. Presidential elections happen. COVID happens. I'll admit, I was really surprised when there was some very strong and interesting pushback to things like mask mandates. I'm thinking of Michigan, the State House, other examples as well. And that sort of made me think or rethink a little bit about what I knew or thought I knew about states' rights. Recent politics has gotten me to think a bit more and more carefully about what I knew or thought I knew about populism in America. And so that pushed me into Andrew Jackson. All to say that I very obviously stand on the shoulders of some real giants. Also, I'm very aware that when I speak to people about Andrew Jackson with you tonight or with my students, I need to be very humble because, again, revision is the name of the game. And I'd like to think that what I wrote is true and eternal. I should have just put it in stone. But something tells me that something's going to happen. That thing is not going to be, we're going to find those lost papers of Andrew Jackson in someone's attic that changes everything. That probably isn't going to happen. What's going to happen is a pandemic, a political turn, an economic turn, and that will give us some insight into the 1820s and 1830s that we didn't have before. And somebody will be saying, yeah, that Brown guy, the book had a shelf life, but as all things must pass. Sorry, that was a George Harrison reference, all things must pass. I might have mentioned I do a little bit of lecturing on the Beatles sometimes. And oh, I appreciate that. Yes, thank you very much. Sometimes you're not even trying and you wish you could tamp it down, but you can't always control it. Yes, yes. So populism and Andrew Jackson. Populism to me also means anti-establishment. And so I very much found this in Andrew Jackson, an anti-establishment, not just a president, but an anti-establishment individual. I think part of this does come from regionalism, the frontier. So there's a little bit of Frederick Jackson Turner. So Andrew Jackson, the first US president to hail west of the Appalachian Mountains. Before that time, presidents had always been East Coast, and Jackson was number 7. So this had gone on for 40 years. And when I say East Coast, to be more specific, presidents only came from 2 states, What are they? Yeah, so codified that we would refer to the Virginians as the Virginia dynasty. But of course, obviously they're going to come from Virginia. So here's Andrew Jackson, right? Now it's true, he was born in the East. He was born in South Carolina, unless he wasn't. There are two states which have markers which say he was born right here. This is the Waxhaw District, Carolinas. The markers in South Carolina are bigger, they're more impressive, they're newer. Do with that what you want. Jackson always swore that he was from South Carolina, but he was just a kid. How would he know? And there's good testimony on both sides. But he goes to the West. He goes to Tennessee. Anti-establishment. I want to say a little bit about his marriage. Okay, so he marries one Rachel Robards Lewis. I mentioned the two last names there because when Jackson married her, she was a married woman. She didn't think she was. He didn't think she was. But he was trained as a lawyer and he didn't check. So she was married and Jackson was in Nashville, young man. They have a very flirtatious relationship. Her husband doesn't like this. Jackson leaves and she ends up leaving with her husband as well. They go up to Kentucky. They were all staying at her mother's house, kind of a boarding house on the frontier. She eventually leaves him and she comes back to Nashville. She hears rumors that he's going to come down and collect her. So she says, I must leave. I'll go to Natchez in Mississippi, which at this time is Spanish territory. Jackson says, I will help you. But we have to be proper about this. So he gets an older gentleman to sort of act as a beard, and he escorts her down to Natchez. Well, her husband never showed up in Nashville. He presumably went to his home state of Virginia and presumably got a divorce. They assume that. And so when Jackson comes down to Natchez to collect Rachel, they were married, unless they weren't. They said they were, but no proof has ever come to light, no marriage license. To be married at that time in Natchez, because of the colonial situation, one had to be Catholic. Neither of the principals were Catholic. And so they go up and they begin to set home in the Nashville area. And then they are aghast to learn later that, in fact, Rachel's husband is still her husband. They know this because now he has pressed for divorce. And the man shows up and says, here's the writ. And the B word is there, bigamy. That my wife, Rachel Lewis, she is now living with another man. So this was embarrassing. What do you do? Well, if you're really prideful, and Jackson was really prideful, you do nothing because that would show perhaps guilt. So the divorce goes through and a couple of years pass before Jackson and Rachel quietly, depending upon what side of the fence you're on, marry or remarry. But the second time it's legal. Anti-establishment, when Jackson runs for the presidency, the second time in 1828, his wife is really attacked hard for this. This is where politics was going already in the 1820s, okay? What happens to Rachel is that she had not great health, and she had heart palpitations for a few years. Jackson is elected in November. He'll take the oath of office in March, but in December, Rachel dies. What does Rachel die of? Depends on what side of the fence you're on. Heart disease, or she died of a broken heart because this pious woman was slandered by Jackson's enemies. Why did this slander not have more purchase? How could the country elect a man like Andrew Jackson? How could every Western state have gone for this man? And even at his times in the 1820s, people around Jackson were saying this is going to boomerang around the opposition, particularly in the West, because you know what? In the East, they've got lots of courts, lots of churches. And in the West, life is a little bit uneven from time to time. We don't have the kind of gentrified amenities that they do. So what some people in the East took as a taboo relationship, there were lots of taboo relationships like that in the country, and you could find many of them in the West. So even before Jackson takes the oath of office, the notion that this guy is anti-establishment, that was already very much there. And he pushed a little bit too. He was in deep mourning, wore black for months, including at the inauguration. This is a man who had died of a broken heart. He would say a part of him had passed, and now he was here to be president of the country, even over the people who had killed his wife. That's the argument. Before Jackson becomes president, he of course runs for the presidency and loses. And this is in 1824. This is Jackson anti-establishment again. So there were four major candidates in 1824. It was really a balkanized politics of regions, right? There's Quincy Adams from the Northeast, Crawford from the Deep South, Henry Clay and Jackson from, depending upon how you cut it at that time, either Southerners or Westerners or Southwesterners. Four candidates, all major. Clearly, nobody's going to get a majority of the electoral votes. They don't. Jackson gets a plurality of electoral and popular votes. And his people say he has a moral hold on the office. Constitution says no majority in the Electoral College has to go to the House of Representatives. And so it does. Not the first time. In the election of 1800, it was between Aaron Burr and Thomas Jefferson. And it was close. And it went on for a while. It went into February, and the inauguration was just weeks away. So one trivia question is, who did Jefferson beat for the presidency in 1800? The book answer, of course, is, well, he beat John Adams of the Federalist Party. Really, he beat the man who became his vice president once, because he wasn't going to be in the ticket a second time, and that was Aaron Burr. So the election goes to the House, and the House goes against Andrew Jackson, and it makes John Quincy Adams president of the United States. Jackson says, the people have spoken, the people have elected me, and it was stolen from them by a corrupt cabal of politicos, East Coast, financiers, East Coast. If there was a circa 1824 swamp, that was what he was referring to. That was what he was referring to. Deep state, perhaps. And so Andrew Jackson does not defer. For 4 years until the next presidential election, he is aggressive in an 1820 kind of way, in his letters, in his communications. You all know what happened. You saw it. The election was stolen. And he keeps that up until he is elected in 1828. All to say that anti-establishment, he has called into question the veracity of Congress, the veracity of the Electoral College, suggesting, well, you can have your Electoral College. I know it's in the Constitution. You could have your Electoral College, or you could have the democracy that you say you live in and you say you want. I guess the lesson here is one could lose a presidential election, say that one has not lost the presidential election, that it was stolen, and in 4 years be elected to the White House. If that should ever happen someday, it would not be the first time. Okay? So Jackson becomes president of the United States, and he, among other things, is known for his very liberal use of the veto power. This too was anti-establishment. So Jackson uses the veto 12 times. They may not sound like a lot, but again, it was 40 years before he becomes chief executive. There were 6 other people. Altogether, they didn't use the veto power combined more than 10 times, more than 10 times. Washington never used it. Jefferson never used it. Jackson used it. No one's going to use the veto power more than Jackson until the 1860s. That someone is Andrew Johnson, who was not elected to the presidency. Lincoln was assassinated. He was not a Republican. He was a Democrat. He was not a Northerner. He was a Southerner. The Civil War has just come to an end. Reconstruction is just taking hold. And the Southern Democrat is in a real fight with Northern Republicans. He uses the veto 29 times. The great overachiever in all this, of course, Franklin Roosevelt, 600 plus vetoes. That's a lot of vetoing. Let's see, in present day, not so much. Barack Obama, like Jackson, 12 vetoes. Donald Trump, 1 term, 10 vetoes. And as of 6 o'clock this evening, Joe Biden, 0 vetoes. We shall see. We shall see. The veto was also very controversial because when Jackson vetoed the National Bank of the United States, and Congress couldn't override it, they didn't have the numbers. But when he did that, Jackson said in a veto message, essentially, I find this to be unconstitutional. Now, this was the second national bank in the United States. There had been one before, which meant that in the 1790s, George Washington had said, I'll sign the bill. It's constitutional. In 1816, James Madison had said, it's constitutional. I'll sign it. If you know anything about your constitutional history, you might know that in Philadelphia in 1787, George Washington presided at the Constitutional Convention, and James Madison was the primary architect of the document. So if those two individuals say it's constitutional, that would seem to be pretty foundational, right? Not only that, but in 1819, the Supreme Court weighed in and said it is constitutional. Jackson said, you know, when I took an oath, I said I would protect and defend the Constitution as I understood it. Well, this is how I understand the Constitution, which meant that for anything Congress wanted to get by Jackson, they would have to consider not simply what they're supposed to consider, is it legal? Is it constitutional? But does this guy on this day happen to think it's constitutional? In other words, Jackson had inserted himself in the checks and balances system. He is now operating, in a sense, as a kind of de facto court and a de facto Congress. And this promoted an intense conversation about the Constitution and about where we are as a country. In some ways, that conversation, it still continues. So another example of Jackson anti-establishment is you might know that he had a kind of a shadow cabinet. It was called derisively a kitchen cabinet. Presidential cabinets can be notoriously fraught. So George Washington's first cabinet, he's got, looks like an all-star team, right? There's Thomas Jefferson, Secretary of State. Then there's Alexander Hamilton, Secretary of the Treasury. And of course, these guys detested each other. It wasn't immediate, but it came, and it came pretty quickly. Jefferson used State Department money to hire a gentleman to translate French communiques, but his real job was to establish a newspaper to attack Alexander Hamilton and what was becoming Hamiltonianism, or the Federalist Party. Hamilton used funds, some government funds, to establish a newspaper which was attacking the Jeffersonian side as well. You can find instances, not always at that level, of cabinets being extremely fractious. Jackson was not really interested in his own cabinet. He didn't like the idea that he had to pick people for regional reasons or for political reasons. He was also kind of a quick burn guy. And so he went through 5 secretaries of the Treasury. He went through 4 secretaries of state. You were in and you were out. There was a lot of churn. There was a lot of burn. What he preferred to do was, leave the cabinet office. And I wish I could say he went to the kitchen, but he didn't really go to the kitchen. But to have people come to his private quarters and talk and discuss. The kitchen cabinet, it was informal, and it involved different people at different times. So if you were in line with what Jackson was thinking about Indian removal, he would talk to you about that. He would get your ideas on that. If you were in line with his thinking about quashing the National Bank, he would be part of the kitchen cabinet. Probably the most famous member was Roger Taney. So Taney was an informal advisor to Jackson for a little while. And the iconic and really sort of class-driven, in interesting respect, bank veto, Taney wrote almost every word of that. And Jackson rewards him. When it's time to finally end the bank, because the veto says, it won't be recharged, but there's still a couple of years left on the, actually 4 years left on its current charter. Jackson wanted to kind of starve it and keep federal money from going into it. How do you do that? He said, we'll just put no more money into it. But the government had a contract with the bank, which said that it had to do this. Legally, it had to put money into the bank. Jackson says, I don't want to do that. So Jackson asked his then Secretary of the Treasury, don't put any more money in. And the guy said, it's against the law. Jackson said, okay, I like you. I just got rid of the Secretary of State. I'll bump you over there. He moved him over there. Jackson brought in another individual, really whose only job was to do Jackson's bidding on the bank war. He didn't vet him enough. And the guy said, I could get in trouble for doing this because it's against the law. Jackson said, you're fired. This is William Duane, who had some Philadelphia connections. And so Jackson went to Taney and he said, would you do this? And Taney said, of course I'll do this. Jackson brought him in as a recess appointment, so he would not have to go through Congress because he probably could not have gotten confirmed, and did the bidding. Then, as the ultimate reward, when John Marshall dies, Jackson elevates him to the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, one of, I think, 5 justices that Jackson appointed on the court. This provoked a lot of anger and a lot of animosity because Jackson seemed to be alighting the law, doing what he wanted to do. But again, Jackson would say, in the West, this is how things are done. This stuff is not illegal. This stuff is doing the bidding of the people and working around the fine trimmings that Easterners try to employ to keep democracy at bay and to keep the people down. One last thing that I want to talk about just a little bit. Jackson, as you might imagine, this was a man who, in many respects, you think of the duels, was very gifted at hating people. Not everybody. If you were loyal to him, and maybe something of a sycophant, he would be very loyal, very protective, real defender. But he could be a tremendous hater, and he could inspire great hate in others. So it does seem fitting that Andrew Jackson was the target of the first assassination attempt of a president of the United States. So when I talk about, was there opposition to Jackson, this kind of anti-establishment presidency, there was, both on the personal level and on the more established level. Jackson was at a memorial service in the Capitol building. There was a South Carolina congressman who had died. He was leaving through the east wing of the building, and a gentleman jumped out, pulled out a pistol, tried to fire it. There was a snap. There was a misfire. Pulled out a second pistol. Same thing. Exactly. What happened here? Well, later people would say it was the atmospherics and the powder, it just didn't catch. But what's that? What's that? That's not fun. Others said Jackson smashed the British at New Orleans because God was right there with him. And God was right there with Andrew Jackson in 1835 when that gentleman tried twice to murder the man. So after the second snap, Jackson pulls out his cane. He's about to go after the man. They sort of separate him. This is John Lawrence. It was probably good for Lawrence that these people stepped in because he was out of gunfire, and Jackson looked like he was pretty angry and going to go after this guy. Obviously, the more formal opposition was the Whig Party, and that was a large-scale opposition, and it was a significant party in our country's history, several congressional majorities, and 2 presidential elections that it captured. Jackson is interesting to me also because I think he is only one of 2 Americans to ever, because people found him to be so obnoxious, to will his opposition into being. The other individual was, I think, Alexander Hamilton. The Jeffersonians, there was no Jeffersonians, but there was opposition to him, to his financial plans, and they come into existence. And the Whigs, they come into existence to smite Andrew Jackson. The Whigs, they were not populists. So what does this leave us with? This leaves us with a legacy that continues to linger. It's populism today. I'm not sure what it's going to be tomorrow, but I suspect that scholars will continue to come back to Andrew Jackson. So you've been very good to listen to all that. I would be happy to listen to you and take whatever questions you might have. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, David Brown. Thank you, David. Please do use the microphone because we are streaming live. We have a question over here, Jim, if you could.
Thank you. You hear different foreign policies and Wilsonian and Hamiltonian, whatever, and Jacksonian always comes up as a different kind of foreign policy. How could you explain it, I guess, in regards to his personality and, how it applies today?
Andrew Jackson's foreign policy. Jackson, as both a military figure and a president, played a key role in convincing the Spanish to sell Florida through an invasion, which included illegally, this is as a military officer, taking Spanish citadels. And there was actually real strong questions in James Monroe's cabinet as to whether Jackson should be broken because of this. Ironically enough, it was John Quincy Adams who saved his bacon, because John Quincy Adams said, look, Jackson just went to Florida. The Spanish know they can't protect this. They will sell this to us now. And they did. It's called the Adams-Onis Treaty. Jackson becomes president a few years later, and Quincy Adams becomes the mortal enemy. So there's Florida, there's the Indian removal policy in the Southwest, and then Jackson desperately wanted to bring Texas into the Union. And it'll happen not under his watch, but in his last days as chief executive, he will recognize the legitimacy of the Texas Revolution. So Jackson's foreign policy is regarded these days as being controversial because it seemed to play well to the plantocracy. The idea that free labor, Native Americans, for example, that was being removed and to be replaced by enslaved labor. And when we look at secession in 1860 and 1861, it takes place in parts. It doesn't all come at once. There were a handful of states that would not leave until Fort Sumter had been fired on, but the first 7 states to leave the Union, these were deep South states, and it corresponds with some of Jackson's actions with Indian removal and pressuring Spain.
Another question over here.
Yeah, so you mentioned that Jackson nominated 5 Supreme Court justices. Is that the most? And how large was the court at that time?
Court was 9 members, like it is today. There's nothing in the Constitution that says it has to be. And we've had some conversations about this as a country the last couple of years. It's not the most. Let's see. I can't verify this because I don't have Wikipedia in front of me, but William Howard Taft had at least 5, if not 6. And Taft was chief executive for only 1 term. Theodore Roosevelt was really jealous of that. The most is George Washington, because Washington got to fill the courts. I can't remember off the top of my head how many nominees Franklin Roosevelt had, but in 12 plus years, I believe that I know he had more than Jackson.
Question in the back?
Thank you, Dr. Brown. Could you talk a little bit about Andrew Jackson and South Carolina and their interest in leaving the Union?
Yeah, this is the nullification crisis. South Carolina said that the federal tariff is hurting South Carolina, that this tariff, it protects industry, which at this time is basically New England and New York. And this had been okay after the War of 1812, because the United States, I wouldn't say it so much won the War of 1812 as it survived the War of 1812. And it became clear that the country needed to have broader strength, including an industrial base. And so you might know that the great nullifier, who was also Andrew Jackson's vice president for a period of time, John C. Calhoun. Calhoun had actually, in 1816, voted for the tariff. But over the next few years, South Carolina makes the argument that it is experiencing a downturn in its economy. This might have something to do with Andrew Jackson's foreign policy, because as you open up lands west of South Carolina, younger people are going to leave their home states and they're going to go to where opportunity is. They still do to this day. But the argument is that it's the tariff that's hurting us, and the tariff is unconstitutional. Jackson never wavered. Jackson says it is constitutional and you will pay it. But he was very shrewd about this. What my research told me, and I really wasn't expecting this with Andrew Jackson, because he could really be a bit of a diva as well, because he knew that it worked for him. He could come on with a persona, really fire, brimstone, but he was very shrewd, very canny. And so on one hand, he quietly puts U.S. troops on ships in the Bay of Charleston. He's ready to go in if he has to. But at the same time, he is negotiating for a lower tariff, a lower tariff, a lower tariff. And it looks like he's going to completely run the table. He had just won the bank war with the veto. He had just won re-election. This is all happening in late 1832. And Henry Clay and John C. Calhoun, they say, we don't agree on much, but we really hate Andrew Jackson. So they get together and they produce a different compromise tariff. It really wasn't as good for the South as what Jackson's plan was, but Clay and Calhoun were determined not to let Jackson have his way with that. This makes Jackson a momentary hero in New England in the North. Otherwise, they didn't really like him that much. But now this was Andrew Jackson standing by the nation. Jackson, a great politician, he said, this is the time for me to go up to New England and do a swing and see all the people there. Because he was getting pressure to travel. He knew that they didn't like him, but his timing was excellent. And they came out in droves, hundreds of thousands of people in New York City, just coming out to see Jackson. It almost killed the old man. I mean, it did. He had to leave, and break the trip early because he was having some heart problems and some digestive issues. John Quincy Adams was following that very closely in the press. He was like a vulture.
We have another question over here.
Given all the banking issues we have right now, I'm curious about the Second National Bank, why Jackson so vociferously hated it.
Mm-hmm.
And how was it different than our Federal Reserve today? It was a different era, I think. So what was it?
Sure, it was a different era. Jackson, as a younger man in the 1790s, lost quite a bit of money through speculation. Again, he was a good friend. He unwisely signed some notes, and the man couldn't pay. It came due for Jackson. This crimped his budget for a few years. Jackson honestly believed that the Constitution was not that the National Bank was not constitutional, and I think he also believed that it represented a direct threat to the Republic. Jackson was not wrong when he said the national bank uses public money to involve itself with politics. It is true that some money from the National Bank in 1828 went up to New England to use for John Quincy Adams's campaign. He didn't know it. Quincy Adams didn't know that. It was true that some politicians, like the great Daniel Webster, were on retainer to the bank and would use their connections, their oratory, he was known as the country's greatest oratory, to protect and defend the institutions of the bank. Jackson's position was either you have the republic or the bank, but you cannot have both. And also, he might have been thinking of British history and Roman history as well. The system that we have now, this is the system put in place in 1913, the Federal Reserve. And I think in very broad terms, it's not unlike the national banking system. And so I find it ironic that if you go to Nashville today, there's a branch bank of the Atlanta National Bank in Nashville. And there's a statue of Andrew Jackson from the State House. And he's looking daggers at that building, I think.
So I think do you have one over there, Jim?
No, but I want to ask the audience a question. How many of you are aware that we actually have a portrait of Andrew Jackson in our presidential portrait collection? Great. Okay. All right. Ironically, it was done by the same artist who did the Abraham Lincoln portrait, both of them from life. Jackson's in New Orleans in 1839, shortly before he died. And of course, Lincoln's in 1863. And if you haven't seen it yet, it's a splendid portrait. So the next question is, where is it in the building? Who can tell me that? It's at the end, okay. It's on the bottom row in the far right-hand corner in the banquet room. Okay, the southwest corner wall has 10 portraits, 2 rows, 5 each. Bottom row, far right-hand side. So please go up and take a look at it. It's a splendid portrait. So
I will ask the last question on that subject to our speaker. So we have 2 of our, I think, greatest paintings in our collection are of, somewhat ironically, Andrew Jackson and Henry Clay. And Henry Clay or Andrew Jackson, a slave owner, anti-tariff, anti-bank, anti all the thing that Lincoln, Why would we have a portrait of Andrew Jackson in this collection? Take a guess, David.
So here's my spur of the moment guess. I do know that Abraham Lincoln, when he was trying to justify to certain constituencies why it was okay to suspend the writ of habeas corpus in a state that did not leave the Union, Maryland, he from time to time did refer to Jackson's, shall we say, extenuation of presidential powers. It's probably not the answer, but that's what I'm coming up with at the moment.
I think that's pretty good, David.
well,
Ladies and gentlemen, David Brown, thank you. Thank you. And thank you, David. And I did miss our next program is actually on April 6th, and it is a Royal Oak program. So Royal Oak is back. We look forward to seeing you on April 6th. Again, David, thank you. Yes. Oh, and we do have books or are for sale in the back, and Dave would be happy to sign them. Thank you. Have a wonderful evening.